Remember, cooking is an art, and you can sort of ebb and flow with your measuring, but baking is a science, and it really does take some sort of careful measurement and awareness of your ingredients to come up with that really perfect dough on a cookie recipe or a cake or whatever you're baking.
While we don't get the day off, banks and post offices don't close, and there's no big sales, National Cookie Day on December 4th can still be one sweet holiday. The English word cookie is derived from the Dutch word koekje, which means little cake. Dutch bakers used to test oven temperatures on small amounts of batter so they wouldn't waste the entire cake mix if the temperature wasn't right. They soon discovered that these tiny pieces of baked batter were quite tasty. When Dutch settlers came to America, the cookie was born, and since it's been transformed into hundreds of different flavors, shapes, and sizes. But making the perfect cookie is a science. On today's Sound Living, tips for making cookies that will melt in your mouth. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. K-State Research and Extension Nutrition Specialist Sandy Procter and Extension Food Scientist Karen Blakeslee offer tips for safely preparing, baking, and storing cookies. As the holiday season continues, cookies will seemingly be everywhere, at home, at the office, and at parties. Procter says not to worry too much about whether a cookie is healthy. Instead, enjoy it and try to watch portion sizes and how many cookies you have.
You can make a really decadent recipe doable if you keep the size of the cookie probably to what the recipe says. Most of us have the tendency to double and triple the size of the cookie and really have a portion size if you look at the label of 4 servings or something. If we can just keep the portion sizes and maybe the variety of what's on our hors d'oeuvre plate, not totally cookie, but a few fruits and vegetables and things along with it, we could probably make it healthier, as well as some of the ingredient substitutions.
Yeah, talk about some of the ingredient substitutions, Karen.
One easy thing to do is to add some fiber by adding some whole wheat flour. Take out half of the all-purpose flour and replace it with whole wheat flour. You may have to add a little more moisture because whole wheat flour tends to suck in and dry up the dough a little more, so you may need to add just a little bit more moisture, whatever ingredient that is. But that way you're adding a little fiber to your cookie products. If anything calls for any kind of a dairy product, instead of a full-fat dairy product, try a low-fat, or in some cases, even a non-fat product might work. In some cases, depending on what recipe it is, the non-fat products may not be the best choice because you do need some of that fat for that particular recipe to work. Case in point would be like frosting, for example. If it's a cream cheese type frosting, the non-fat cream cheese really doesn't work. It just makes too loose of a frosting and it never really sets up. Another option would be, instead of milk chocolate chips, use dark chocolate because dark chocolate has a bolder, richer flavor, and maybe you can cut back on the chocolate chip amount a little bit and still get that good pop of chocolate flavor.
What about in terms of adding ingredients that you maybe wouldn't at other times of the year, like nuts and fruits and even jams?
Dried fruits are a really easy addition to a lot of things, even if a recipe doesn't call for anything like that. Maybe there would be a dried fruit that you could sprinkle in that would complement the cookie flavor. Even replacing some of the chocolate chips with dried fruits like dried cranberries, raisins, even dried apricots, things like that, just to change it up a little bit, and it adds a little different color to the cookie too. So those are some good options to try.
Sandy?
One of the things that I like to do, and it works in certain cookie recipes, is you can replace about half the fat with applesauce in some cookies. And I like the flavor of it. Depending on the type of cookie, it affects the texture, but for a chewy cookie, that's not a bad thing to do, and I always feel real virtuous when I do that. Add more fruit, take out half the fat, and then I can eat more cookies.
Another option on the fat topic is eggs. One thing I've tried it with muffins. I haven't tried it with cookies yet, but one of these days I will, is to use ground flaxseed. You use 1 tablespoon of ground flaxseed and 3 tablespoons of water and rehydrate the flaxseed, and that replaces 1 egg. You also get the bonus of a healthy fat and a little extra fiber into your product. So that would be something to try to reduce the cholesterol and the fat content from the eggs that you use.
Oatmeal is a really good cookie.
Right. And a lot of recipes that call for that have a nice amount of oatmeal, and sometimes that's in combination with some other healthful ingredients like peanut butter. And you can add some texture and stretch recipes a little bit that way. Other cereal recipes and cookies like boxed cereal can add a lot of crunch without a lot of extra calories. Sort of a crisp rice cereal or some of those can really make an interesting texture and sort of stretch out the sweet and fat parts of the dough so that you have a slightly lower calorie cookie recipe. I hate to talk about reducing calories in cookies because some foods, it's just, those are what they are. And if you watch your portions and you watch the amount that you eat, I'm kind of the school that thinks like a cookie, instead of substituting it and changing it to where it's healthy, just enjoy a really good cookie. Watch your portion sizes. All foods fit in moderation. And to sort of, enjoy that sugar cookie that just melts in your mouth. And part of the reason it does that is because of its maybe not your everyday ingredients that you want to eat all the time, but just that combination of good ingredients, special time of year that, when this is Grandma's cookie, this is when we have it. And I think we're kind of to that point in the year. So I would recommend that people sort of embrace the idea of it, enjoy it when they have it, but we'll just watch the amount and frequency that they have that really good cookie.
And cookies will last a long time when they're stored properly.
Well, exactly. And I was just going to follow up with what Sandy was talking about, the portion size. Don't leave the cookies setting out all day either. Kind of portion them out. And if you freeze them, that's one way that you can slow the progress down as far as how many you eat a day. So freezing is a great way to store them, and now's the time to start getting the baking going and freeze those products. That way you can have them done and ready to go, and then when you're ready to use them, just pull out a few at a time so that you save some for later on in the holiday season.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the safety aspects, some of the food safety concerns. Obviously, we're using raw eggs in most of these cookie recipes. Therefore, we shouldn't be eating the cookie dough as we make the cookies.
Yeah, I don't make many friends when I say this, but we really should not be tasting the cookie dough because of the raw eggs. There is that potential that raw eggs could contain salmonella. I really don't want to see anybody getting sick from eating raw cookie dough. And I know I've heard of reports where it has happened. So resist the temptation. Wait till those cookies are done and enjoy them that way. The other thing, just general good food safety practices. Always wash your hands before, during, and after any kind of baking and cooking. When you're handling raw eggs and you're done handling the raw eggs, wash your hands before you move on to something else. And that way you prevent the chance of cross-contamination. Washing your utensils in between tasks. If you've only got one wooden spoon and you've used that to mix up your raw cookie dough, don't use that to mix up something else. Be smart about that. They're really simple practices to think about.
If you make a large batch and you only bake half of it, you want to put the rest in the fridge, or should you bake them all at once and store them as a baked cookie?
No, you could freeze your cookie dough. You could even portion it out and then freeze them on a cookie sheet that way. And then after they're frozen, put them in a freezer container or a plastic reclosable container and freeze them. And then when you're ready to use them, just pull them out, put them on the cookie sheet and bake them. And that's a real quick way to make cookies.
Does it change the baking time at all if they're frozen?
It might. It might take a couple minutes longer. It may also slow down the spread of the cookie because it's been cold, and that slows down how the cookie will spread. So just be aware of that. It may take a couple minutes longer.
Yeah, you may want to adjust your oven temperature 25 degrees downward to allow for that warming up of the dough before it sets and give it a little more chance to spread like that. But also you can set them out at room temperature for just a very few minutes, not long enough to have them thaw out completely, but just to sort of get those ice crystals off and sort of come to room temperature and then go in the oven, and that'll help the spread too.
You kind of talked about the baking process. I've noticed on several recipes it depends on whether you're using a dark pan or you're using more of a silver pan. The baking time and the temperature may vary?
Yes, that can make a difference. Dark pans tend to bake a little hotter, and they'll make the bottoms of your cookies darker because of that dark surface. Shinier pans tend to reflect heat off of your cookies, and so you won't get as dark of a browning. I'm not saying that one cookie sheet is better than another. It's knowing how your cookies work with that cookie sheet and in your oven, because it may be the case, like Sandy just mentioned, turning down the temperature of your oven 25 degrees just to slow down that heat, especially on a dark cookie sheet and even on like a ceramic stone type cookie sheet. Those tend to hold a lot of heat, and those can make your products darker. It could make them spread more too, because if you're using a ceramic stone, they don't cool down between batches that you're baking. So that spread's going to happen a little faster. So just know how your cookie sheets work with your oven and your cookies.
And maybe even the temperature of your oven, because I hear some people talk about, oh, my oven runs hot or mine runs cold. Is there a way to tell whether your oven is actually accurate?
Get an oven thermometer. That's the best way to know. Don't always rely what your dial setting is telling you on your stove. So get an oven thermometer. Also, preheat your oven at least 30 minutes before you put anything in the oven, because that way it completely gets heated up. If you put it in right when your oven beeps when it says, oh, I'm ready, that may not be quite at the temperature you need yet. You've set it at 350. It may only be about 300 yet. So start the oven when you start mixing up your ingredients, and that way it preheats while you're mixing up your product.
And remember, too, that with cookies, it's important to note where your racks are in your oven. They need to be placed sort of in the center of the oven for even baking. Some of these things that Karen and I are talking about sound like the conversations we have with 4-H'ers when we're judging. You can practically tell where the cookie was in the oven and what kind of pan they use just by looking at it. And I always enjoy the looks on little kids' faces when it's like, how did you know that? And it's like, oh, these are the things you can do when you're a cookie judge. You can tell these things, but it comes from looking at a lot of cookies in the face. But just being aware of the type. It's not that one pan is better than another one. I really like an air-baked cookie sheet, but that's not for everybody. Mm-hmm. But it just really depends on knowing the type of cookie sheet you have, knowing your oven, and the placement of the racks. Thanksgiving is notorious for moving those around, and then you've got to move them back up. But there's a place probably where cookies work out really best, where the air circulation is just right for making an evenly browned cookie.
Yeah, and convection ovens are going to bake differently than your standard ovens, because convection ovens have a fan in the back blowing around hot air. So they're going to bake a little faster, they're going to bake hotter. So that is a case where you really should turn down the temperature 25 degrees so you don't overbake your cookies.
How do you guys feel about parchment paper?
I love parchment paper.
It really speeds things up and speeds up cleaning. And it also, I think it helps the bottoms of those cookies look really nice and uniform.
Mm-hmm. And especially if you have a dark pan and you're having trouble with the browning of it, don't throw away your pan. Put a piece of parchment paper on there, and that'll be a buffer between your dough and your pan, and you'll end up with a better cookie.
You've talked about it several times about the color of the cookie, but that really is kind of an important aspect. People really, kind of fawn over that perfect looking cookie.
Well, it does affect, the structure of it. It affects the flavor in the end, because if you got a burnt cookie on the bottom, that's going to destroy the flavor of the cookies. So it really does make a difference.
Any last tips people might want to keep in mind?
Measuring ingredients is really important. When you're measuring flour, stir your flour up before you measure it and spoon it into your measuring cups, and then level it off. That way you're measuring your ingredients accurately. If you just dip your measuring cup into the flour sack and shake it out, tap it on the table, you're going to end up with too much flour, or maybe even not enough flour in some cases. So it's important to pay attention to the measuring. That's really, really important.
Remember, cooking is an art, and you can sort of ebb and flow with your measuring, but baking is a science, and it really does take some sort of careful measurement and awareness of your ingredients to come up with that really perfect dough on a cookie recipe or a cake or whatever you're baking.
And don't be afraid to experiment. Try some new recipes. There's a million of them on the internet.
There are, and that's the fun part about this. Try something new, and you just might end up with a new favorite Christmas cookie.
That's K-State Research and Extension food scientist Karen Blakeslee and Extension Nutrition Specialist Sandy Procter. For more information on food and nutrition, visit your county or district extension office or go online to the Extension website, www.ksre.ksu.edu. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.